Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 183 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, I do something a little bit different because I'm at Podcast Movement 2015 recording this episode. It's a two-part episode. In the first part, I am sponsored by the MobilePro.net company, which does audio recordings. They allowed me to record at their on-site studio, and I talk about the compliance retreat. In part 2 of this podcast, I discuss why I podcast, why I think it's important, why I'm passionate about it, but more importantly, a call to action for my listeners to come onto the podcast and talk about their passion, their issues, things that interest them. So it's a little bit different, but I hope you will enjoy it, and I hope you will accept my call to action if you do have something to say to add to the conversation. So please join us. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I'm recording this episode in the Studio 3 of the Mobile Pro, who is sponsoring this episode. I am at Podcast Movement 2015, learning all things about podcasts that hopefully I can bring to you for the upcoming episodes. Sean Smith, the owner of the Mobile Pro, is put up a mobile recording studio and was kind enough to allow me to record this podcast. So he's sponsoring this episode. He is the expert on all things audio around podcasts and recordings. On this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report, I wanted to discuss a new service offering that I've blogged about last week and I've come out with, and that's called the Compliance Retreat. The Compliance Retreat is a variation of the traditional business retreat, where business leaders would go off-site for a weekend, a couple of days, and do some deep strategic thinking. And I've used this as a basis to develop the Compliance Retreat service offering. It's a little bit different because with the Compliance Retreat service offering, you can hire me to act as a facilitator around your compliance program. This is not a risk assessment. This is not an assessment of where your compliance program may be, although that would certainly be part of the discussion. But it's a more focused look at your compliance program, where it is, what enhancements you might want to put in place, what are some of the best practices that other corporations in your industry and indeed other industries are using, what are some of the most recent communications, messages we've had from the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and other regulators regarding anti-corruption compliance and, more importantly, anti-corruption enforcement. So what I would do is work with you in your corporation to develop a more focused compliance program for your company. The way the compliance retreat would work is you would provide to me the written policies and consisting of written program consisting of policies and procedures and other materials, any risk assessments you might have had, or any other information you wanted me to review. Then I would come to your corporate location, wherever that might be, and I would sit down with you and your compliance team for a day. And we would go through what are the challenges that you face. This is a unique opportunity for you as the CCO or compliance professional to understand what is out there for you to utilize in moving forward with your compliance program. But more importantly, the focus is on your company. Certainly you can have a risk assessment, and that risk assessment can be used as a roadmap for enhancements of your compliance program going forward. But the Compliance Retreat offers you an opportunity to sit down with one of the country's top nuts and bolts FCPA compliance practitioners, myself, who has worked inside of a corporation to help both develop and enhance compliance solutions towards your compliance programs. What are the challenges that you face? What are the sales models that you utilize across the globe? Do you use distributors? Do you use commissioned sales agents? Do you have an employee base that sells your products? So we take a look at the challenges that you have and you are facing around your compliance program. And from that, you're able to ask some very detailed questions about specific examples and situations that you face in your compliance program. Of course, because it's a retreat of your compliance team and perhaps other C-suite executives who might need to be a part of an overall strategic discussion, it's going to be confidential to your company. So you would have the ability to have Chatham House rules or hot tub rules, whatever you may call it, but the information is going to stay inside of your corporation. This is really a unique opportunity for you to utilize that concept of being able to ask any question with a studied professional who can talk about the solutions that other companies have brought to bear. Obviously, many of the policies and procedures and techniques of compliance are well known across multiple industries, but you may not be able to study them with the in-depth detail that I've been able to study them, and I've been able to write about them, and I've been able to talk about them. What I can do is help guide you through some of the more difficult questions that you have, and we can talk through in an informal environment methods and manners for you to implement solutions. This would be in a this would be in a site which would allow you to really spend a day focusing on what are the problems you have and what are some of the solutions going forward. A risk assessment is certainly something that can be useful, and you should engage in that exercise, if not on an annual basis, certainly on a biennial basis. And a risk assessment can be utilized as a roadmap for you going forward. But you may have questions about the prioritization, the priority of the risks that have been assessed in your program that may need further review or further risk management put around them. Are you in any new markets? Do you have new sales offerings? Do you have new service offerings? Are you in situations where there are high profit projects that you're beginning to engage in? Are you in countries where the risk may have changed? The classic example right now is in Brazil, where from the corruption standpoint, we have the Petrobras scandal, which many people are certainly aware of. It has moved from a scandal simply surround Petrobras and into companies who did business directly with Petrobras, and now we have other companies who did business indirectly with Petrobras being brought into the ambit of the investigation. Certainly politicians in Brazil are feeling the heat around the Petrobras scandal, but now we've got the FIFA scandal, and certainly Brazil is well recognized as a world soccer power, and the passion of soccer in Brazil was on display in the 2014 World Cup. But with the allegations of corruption and bribery around FIFA, some of the specific allegations against the U.S. company who's involved with putting apparel and shoes around the Brazilian soccer team, some of the named individuals in the Brazilian National Soccer Federation, the concerns and the risk profiles of companies doing business in Brazil has changed, and this may not have been something that you looked at in your last risk assessment. This may not have been something that was even on your radar, and so it's important that you be able to make changes and take a look at new risks as they arise. So are you engaged in any construction or other activities in Brazil around the 2016 Olympics? An entire plethora of issues around Brazil that you'll need to consider that perhaps were not on your risk radar even last year. Is a country sweep coming to Brazil? Has the Department of Justice said anything about Brazil? They're certainly investigating Petrobras in the United States. Will that expand out into U.S. companies? These are just some of the questions that can come up really now with social media and worldwide media on a moment's notice. And these may not have been strategic questions that were a part of your compliance review or compliance questions which were addressed in your risk assessment. These are some of the things that you can take a look at in a compliance retreat. So you'll sit down, provide the information to me, and then we'd sit down for a day. Then we'd go through all of the specific questions you might have. We'd go through all of the some strategic and tactical solutions to some of those. Then we would take a broader step back, a 40,000-foot view of where do you want to go with your compliance program and what are some of the steps that you can take. Are there technological solutions that you can bring to bear? As most folks know, I live in Houston, and the energy economy has gone in the tank. And so there are lots of innovative solutions from compliance practitioners in the city of Houston on doing compliance in an economic downturn that you may not have had to face yet, but they are techniques that you can bring to bear for your compliance program. If there's a technological solution that can allow you to reduce headcount or do compliance more efficiently, is that something that you could or should consider? What technological solutions are out there? Are you doing enough via technology on due diligence? What about your third-party management systems? What about your training, your codes of conduct? What about your social media strategy? All of these can be looked at from a 40,000-foot view in a compliance retreat and allow you to bring them down into your individual compliance program. This would really give you an opportunity to think about, to look at, and to consider a wide variety of both strategic and tactical solutions that, frankly, you may not have had time to consider in your day-to-day operations. I recognize everyone has a day job, particularly in compliance, and so the opportunity to take a look at these things from a retreat perspective is an opportunity that I think you could and should afford yourself the chance to do. So I hope you will consider the compliance retreat. If you need more information on it, it's available. Some additional information is available on my website at Advanced Compliance Solutions. And you can contact me at tfox@tfox Law if you have any questions. I hope you'll consider this. I think it's going to be a very interesting and very helpful solution for many compliance programs going forward. The concepts are well known and the techniques of doing this, but they've not been applied to compliance practitioners in the compliance department. So once again, I hope that I can bring innovation to the compliance department. There are business solutions to legal problems, and those are available to you, and I can help facilitate that discussion within your corporation based upon my reading and writing and listening and thinking about all of these solutions. So please give me a call. I look forward to visiting with you. And once again, I'm at Podcast Movement 2015. And today's podcast was sponsored by the MobilePro.net company owned by Sean Smith. It is the way to learn about audio for any recordings you might make. This is Tom Fox.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to part 2 of the 2015 Podcast Movement episode. In this part, I articulate a call to action and ask you to let me know if there's something you'd like to talk about on my podcast going forward. This part of the episode comes in at just over 12 minutes. Thank you for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again, and this is part 2 of my podcast from Podcast Movement 2015. I'm really thrilled to be here with many of my fellow podcasters, also with Leona Lewis, who has been on the podcast before. So it's been quite an eventful first day. I've learned a lot and hopefully can bring some of these lessons to the FCPA compliance and ethics report going forward. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the desire I have to spread the message of compliance. The reason I founded this podcast was to be able to talk as opposed to write about compliance. I think that what we are doing, and we in the compliance community, is we have developed a business solution to a legal problem, and that legal problem is compliance with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the UK Bribery Act, and other anti-corruption laws across the globe. And I want to help evangelize about the business solutions that have been developed. So one of the ways I do that is by bringing on folks to visit with about compliance, the FCPA, business ethics, leadership, and other topics. And I want to use this part of the podcast to encourage you to contact me if you'd like to be on the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I try to do one podcast a week where I talk about some specific topic or tactic of compliance. So the first half of this podcast dealt with the compliance retreat that I have developed. Last week I talked about the FCPA Masterclass training that I've initiated, which will begin in Houston in September. These are specific tactics that you can utilize in your program. But more than just me talking about the nuts and bolts of compliance, I like to interview folks to find out what they're thinking. And please do not be intimidated by an interview. The interviews are most generally phone interviews because I can tend to get a more consistent quality. But I tell people to think of it as a cup of coffee with Tom, where you spend 20 or 30 minutes talking about something that interests you, something you're passionate about, something you've written about, something you've seen recently, or just what's on your mind. And as many of you know, this week I had Kate Atkinson from the law firm of Miller and Chevalier talk about their 2015 summer report. I've had such diverse folks as Gar Hurst, who is in the import compliance arena, talk about a software app, which I think is basically a social media tool, but he was able to develop it as a response to a need for a gap in the compliance practice in his specialty of the law. But I've also talked about a wide variety of other things. So, for instance, Tim Peterson has talked about the current FIFA scandal. As many of you will recall, I had a 5-part series about the World Cup and compliance last summer with Mike Brown from Infortal. During the Oscar season, Jay Rosen and I had a month-long series about the Oscars, how the nominations are made, what goes into the voting process, and how the winners are determined, which Jay, of course, being formerly in the movie business, brought a unique insight. That there are different ways to look at compliance, and that was certainly a more unique one, but I think it was one that was certainly well received. I've had Ben Lockwood talk about risk assessments recently. If Ben has written extensively, and he's very passionate and articulate about risk assessments, but say you've had a particularly signature enforcement action or case, or in the case of Tim Traynor, he had a declination, and he was lead counsel for Petro Tiger when they received their declination. And Tim came on and talked about how he was able to help the company obtain a declination in the face of having 3 senior executives plead guilty to substantive FCPA violations. So those are the kinds of things that certainly interest people. Deborah Bruce talked about law firm funding and investment. Of course, I have some guests that pop up from time to time. Matt Kelly, the editor of Compliance Week, is certainly a favorite. Matt is well-versed in a wide variety of topics. Certainly, it's important, I think it's important to keep up with what's going on at Compliance Week. Equally, I've had Adam Turteltaub and Roy Snell, both from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, SCCE. Adam talked about recently the comings and goings at SCCE and the annual conference, which is coming up. Scott Killingsworth has written recently on personal liability of chief compliance officers, something that certainly is in everyone's mind. But I've had other guests. Mara Sin came on for a couple of podcasts One was she had a very interesting take on the decision to self-disclose or not, and it really went against the conventional wisdom that many of us, including myself, might have had on this. Yet Mara was able to give, I thought, a very good explanation of why a company may decide not to. We've had Dan Cogdale, a very prominent criminal defense lawyer in Houston, talk about criminal procedure issues in individual FCPA prosecutions. As many of you know, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and John Champion, along with his partner Ken Ray, are on a decades-long journey through every episode of every Star Trek television show and movie. And they're now in TNG, Star Trek The Next Generation, after having gone through the original series, the original cartoon series, and the original series movies. And so I visited with John a couple of times on leadership lessons from Star Trek, and I really enjoy those. But they give a different perspective on leadership. Obviously, Captain Kirk had one style of leadership, very dynamic. Jean-Luc Picard in The Next Generation has a different style. And John was able to talk to us about those different styles of leadership. I was lucky enough to have Christine Robidoux from Canada talk about recent Canadian whistleblower initiatives. One of my favorite people, Jeannie Dietrich, has visited a couple of times about her specialty, which is public relations. She's got a great company, probably the greatest name ever, called Spin Sucks. But the confluence of PR and compliance I find very interesting, particularly as through the lens of which Jeannie looks at it. Now, these are just a few of the recent guests I've had, and I've highlighted them specifically because they have all brought something to the compliance debate. And certainly myself, as an expert in the area of the nuts and bolts of compliance, how do you create, implement, or enhance a compliance solution inside of a corporation, I feel like is something that I'm equipped to talk about and equipped to visit with you about. But by having these guests come on, I think it gives a wider perspective, even if they're outside the compliance arena, the underlying process that they may utilize. So Tanya Otterstein-Lees is a fitness expert, but she has a very unique and defined process that she helps people walk through to help make them more fit, physically, spiritually, mentally, in a wide variety of disciplines. And those are some of the ways to think through compliance that I think some of these guests are able to bring to the table. So if you would like to come on the podcast, if you have an issue that you're passionate about, if you've written an article recently, I would ask you to get in touch with me because I'd love to have you on. It's 20 to 30 minutes. It won't take long. And once again, it's just having a cup of coffee with Tom and you talking about what you're passionate about. So one of the things I learned from the Podcast Movement 2015 conference is to bring on other passionate speakers in your industry, in your area. So that's what I'm asking you to do. And as a call to action, I would ask you to get in touch with me because I'd love to have you on the podcast. There's no one else podcasting in this space. So if you come on, you're going to be heard and your voice will be listened to. And whatever you have to say broadens the compliance debate and broadens my mission of being passionate and bringing my passion to the compliance debate to the rest of you, my audience, and the listeners. So it's Tom Fox. You can reach me at tfox at tfoxlaw.com. Obviously, you can check out the podcast. I blog every day at the FCPA Compliance and Ethics blog. I'm a columnist for Compliance Week. I write regularly for the SCCE. You can check me out in any of those areas. But I most fervently hope that if you have something to say, whatever your message is or whatever your voice is, please give me a shout. I'd love to have you come on the podcast. with that, I thank you for listening and look forward to visiting with you again.